Hey, folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. I'm going to pull this down so that I'm actually looking at the screen while I'm looking at the camera. He is Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This is Mind Your Banners for Thursday, January 16th, 2025. Apologies that we didn't do a post-game Mind Your Banners Tuesday night after the Illinois game. I don't know if this is one of those, like, how the sausage is made kind of things, but, Mike, we talked about it a little bit, and it just felt like there was probably going to be more ground to cover in discussing just sort of the state of everything with IU basketball than we could really get to in a 15 to 20 minute show when we were both obviously also kind of beholden to other duties, deadlines, writing, things like that. If we have some time at the end, I know you were in Iowa City. I want to talk about Indiana's big win, the women's big win at Iowa over the weekend, but I don't think there's any way past what is obviously sort of story in IU circles, in Bloomington, in Indiana land, for lack of a more artful term right now, which is the direction of a basketball season that took I don't want to say necessarily a sudden turn, but certainly a jarring turn for the worse over the last 6 days. A 25-point loss at Iowa. That was Iowa's largest win in the series in almost 30 years. Followed by a 25-point loss at home to Illinois in a game when Indiana surrendered 60 points and a half. I think it was the first time in a quarter century maybe Indiana had surrendered 60 and a half. That is the largest single number scored in regulation by an opponent in Assembly Hall history. That is the second largest margin of defeat in Assembly Hall history. And we were obviously both in the building for that when you made the Iowa trip. I did not. But we were both in the building for Illinois. I mean, in some ways, losing by 25 kind of almost flattered certainly the effort Indiana gave in the first half. Indiana was a lot better in the second, but as Mike Woodson himself said, the damage had been done. I guess to unpack these defeats first, I mean, there's just a lot of concerning here. Indiana's looked lethargic at starts. Indiana has looked sort of, I guess the word would almost be sort of, stunned by early punches it's absorbed. And in both cases, Iowa more so in the second half, and Illinois more so in the first. Indiana has just, there have been pronounced periods in both of these games where at both ends of the floor, Indiana's just kind of lost its will and its intention, and the scores reflected it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been kind of harping on the effort thing all season in terms of like the first half.
Yeah.
Like, why has this team struggled? And Woodson has in Iowa, he said he didn't think effort was sort of an issue, even though, I thought it was. And they just really didn't show up at Illinois. Against Illinois in that first half. And then the inconsistency, we've talked a lot about it, and Mackenzie Mbako, I think, has been kind of like the symbol of it. And he's been, the last 3 games has been like the worst stretch of his, young collegiate career. But the whole team, I mean, we've seen, they win 5 straight. We think maybe they've figured it out. And then it goes immediately to the wheels fall off. And, I know a lot of fans have sort of pointed to, is it these guys are getting paid? Is it, that they don't have like the necessary buy-in to like Indiana? I don't know what the explanation is. But, I think those two sort of, you've seen that all season, and then it kind of exploded over the last 2 games.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll address it just because the first comment that came up is our IU struggled more function than mercenaries, lack of team cohesion or leadership. There are tons of programs out there that are thriving with transfers. Like, you cannot just say it's because these kids don't care or they're just here for a paycheck or they're mercenaries. There are dozens of examples of programs. I mean, Illinois is a great one. Illinois, I think, returned one scholarship player from a season ago. And it's not like Illinois is going to be an NIL cheap program. I don't know, where they stand in comparison to Indiana or, Kansas, Kentucky, et cetera. But Illinois is not going to just be sort of like operating on a pauper's budget. And they had to remake basically their entire roster through the offseason. And right now, Illinois is, 8th in KenPom. They're 13-4. They're 5-2. The only really bad loss I would argue they have, and it's not a horrible loss, but it's the only one that really raises your eyebrow, is the USC loss at home over the weekend. But the point is, there are plenty of programs out there that are doing well with, rosters, if they're not necessarily completely underpinned by transfers, are certainly fueled in part or built in part, around, some of the pillars being transfers. That's not the issue by itself. That is only an issue if I think you have more undercurrent concerns. And I want to start with what's going on the floor. There's a lot to talk about here. There really is. I thought one of the, I know you and I were both impressed by the way Luke Goody and Anthony Leal kind of answered a lot of questions from the media, just kind of the tone, the way they talked about things, whatever. But one of the things that stuck with me is I'm please understand, I'm not bigging up my question. I ask terrible questions. It was just the answer that stuck with me. I asked Anthony Leal basically, yet again, some really pronounced struggles defensively, whether it's stopping the ball, whether it's covering shooters, navigating ball screens, what is kind of the problem here, so to speak? How do you go about fixing some of this? And I'm pulling up the quote specifically. This is Anthony Leal said, quote, "To be honest, there are a lot of defensive schemes we can run, and it really doesn't matter what we do if we're not going to do it hard with effort and toughness. That's what it comes down to. Obviously, they have some really talented players on their team. They're a good team, but we know we're a talented team. We're talented and a good team as well. We just aren't matching anybody's toughness or togetherness or effort right now. I think that's the problem." Again, I don't think you can just pin that on transfers. There are plenty of teams out there that are, including the one that put 94 points in Indiana, that are playing hard with transfers, with rosters that are built around transfers. There is just kind of a disconnect right now, whether it's what's being emphasized in game planning, whether it is, sort of a tone issue from the coaching staff on down through the roster, whether it's player leadership. It's probably a little bit of a lot of different things. But you were right. You have been talking about kind of the waxing and waning of Indiana's effort this season. It feels like, and I thought a lot of what Luke Goody and Anthony Leal said on Tuesday night really circled back to the idea that Indiana even itself recognizes we're just not playing hard enough. We're not playing focused enough. That the fundamentals aren't there. So there's really no reason to talk about the schemes or, the X's and O's, so to speak. I think Mike froze.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that Anthony Leal sort of earned a role as my thing screwed up. Hold on.
I think you're good.
Am I right?
Yeah, you're good. Keep going.
All right. So, no, but I think one of the reasons Anthony Leal's earned a role is because of his effort in recent weeks, that he's provided some extra, defensively has been sort of more locked in, has been sort of willing to do the dirty work. I mean, you talk about sort of that Illinois game, I think one of the pronounced areas where IU was out hustled was the rebounding. I think it was, in the first half it remained lopsided the whole game. But it was so pronounced. There was one possession where they had 3 offensive rebounds in one half court set. One time it got knocked out to the center who hit a 3, and that led to some boos. So I think you've seen that. That's why Leo's sort of been on the floor, and nobody's sort of matched that. I think Langdon Hatton is sort of the other guy that's done that a couple of times, where just playing with effort that the other guys haven't sort of given. And Woodson sort of been blind to sort of like, or hasn't offered any sort of like, what's the issue? They haven't said it's been a sort of a problem in practice. So it's like hard to trace like where it's all sort of coming from. Is it just, why is that? Luke Goody said, I think the phrase was that they keep getting punked, which is very sort of a vivid, I think, criticism of the team. And so, yeah, I mean, effort, it's sort of shocking just in terms of the last two games, like how lopsided it's been. I mean, you saw an Illinois team that just really wanted it more, for most of that game. I think maybe the first 7 minutes of the second half was maybe the exception.
I think what's striking to me, and listen, I've banged this drum for a long time because I've covered a lot of teams that, to which this applied. But what's striking to me is sort of this question of like, what changed in the immediate aftermath of that run where Indiana wins 5 in a row. They win 9 of 10. Even that Nebraska game, in the context of winning 9 out of your 10 games, you're sort of allowed to say, hey, that was even that was kind of a competitive game in a tough environment on the road, and you just kind of faded down the stretch. But, we talked about, for example, Indiana's rebounding issues. I mean, that's probably their best 3-game rebounding stretch of the season. Only Penn State has an offensive rebound rate better than 19.4%. Indiana's offensive rebound rate's around 30 to 38%, which is high for this team, or at least what it had been up to that point in the season. You felt like you were seeing Indiana make more of those effort plays. They were turning the ball over less. They had a bit of a turnover issue against Penn State, but like their turnover rate against Winthrop was 11.1%, Rutgers 10.7%, USC 8.4%, and that's a USC team that then turns around and wins pretty impressively at Illinois. And so you think maybe that win is even better than we thought it was, initially that USC team is going to be a little bit more difficult for people or for other teams. And I think what's pronounced and what's jarring is, sort of like what happens that a team can look like it is sort of on this steady building process that, beginning with that Providence game in Atlantis, you sort of felt like, even through some hiccups, Indiana was starting to put some pieces into place, starting to kind of arrange some things in the ways that it needed to. Even through Malik Renew's injury, it was getting figuring some of that out. And then Iowa is just sort of like running into a brick wall, which, listen, even to some extent, and we can talk about that game if you want to, in terms of like Indiana just looking so bad offensively against a terrible defensive team. But there's always an extent to which in a sport like basketball, you're allowed to get blown out every once in a while. That's going to happen to most teams, once in a blue moon. But to back that up with just how listless and ugly and disengaged Illinois looked, I think part of what sort of jars Indiana fans is I think they just started to feel like maybe the team had figured some stuff out that would get them to buy back in, that would get them to sort of say, okay, maybe it's time to give this team a little bit of the benefit of the doubt again. And then, boom, it all kind of evaporates.
Well, I also think there's a difference. You can go on the road and have a poor performance, but when you're at home and you're losing by 32 or 30 in the first half, I mean, there's really no explaining. I mean, like, you can't. I mean, especially in sort of like, fans will call Assembly Hall like hallowed ground to sort of not show any fight. In that game, the only reason that's it under 30 is they scored, I think, 5 points in the last 38 seconds or something like that. So, I mean, by sort of like a stroke of luck almost, that it's not a 30-point loss, and they've only had one of those in the history of the building. So, and like you said, 60 points was, I think, also the most Illinois had ever scored on the road, or sort of, it's just like the numbers are shocking, and like, how do you get to that point? And I don't know. I like you said, it was such a, because they finally had developed some sort of identity a little bit on offense with the spacing on the floor. They were starting to shoot a little bit better, even though you kind of thought maybe they'd come back down to earth just because they've struggled for so long. Umar Bala was sort of playing his best basketball, and so like you said, you think they turn a corner, and then it looks like this team's just lost at sea. Just the extreme nature of it begs the question: is this is this done? Like, is this obviously just it stems from coaching. Is it coaching?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, we will zoom out in a bit here. I don't want to race sort of straight to kind of the largest like possible sort of view of this. I mean, I think to your is it coaching? I mean, even Mike Woodson, I think, has said, at least to some extent, has been like, yes, it is. I'm not getting this team ready. I'm not keeping this team kind of on the even keel it needs to. And I think where the frustration is really born right now from this fan base, I know I put together a stat that's kind of done a couple laps around social media about the sheer number of losses that Mike Woodson, I think it's up now to, if I'm not mistaken, either 13 or 14 regular season losses in Big Ten play of at least, I think, 15 plus points under Mike Woodson now. The sense that when things go wrong, they just they go completely wrong, and it's like everyone just sort of disengages, and there's no sort of consistency of pushback. Like even that Iowa game, you felt like maybe Indiana kind of got its feet underneath it when it it's down 21-8, it comes back to lead 28-25, and then just it just kind of just disappears. I think it's the idea as much as anything that, like, competitively speaking, in terms of execution, certainly to a certain extent in terms of effort, obviously in terms of some of the skill stuff like rebounding, shooting, whatever, ball security. I think part of the frustration stems from the fact that even in year 4, it just never feels like Indiana is very far away from just kind of going off the cliff. And it's never been permanent, although I would argue it's never been quite as bad as it was in the last 2 games. I don't know when the last time Indiana lost consecutive games by a combined 50 points was. Certainly in conference play. But it is kind of this feeling that, to someone's point about the transfer portal earlier, by all accounts, Indiana went out and got some very talented players. And I think, in fairness, like we've talked about this at various points, we see the talent. You see the talent in Miles Rice. You see it in Mackenzie Mbako. Mbako's not a transfer portal ad, but I'm just talking about this roster in general. You see it in Malik Renew. You see it in Umar Balo and Trey Galloway and so forth. But it's the inconsistency, and not just the inconsistency of performances, but just how dramatic that inconsistency, the impact of that inconsistency can be when you go from, hey, the defense is getting better, the rebounding is getting better, the ball security is getting better, the shooting's getting better, the lineups make more sense. Everything is, kind of steadily on a climb here. And then you're never more than one bad 10-minute stretch away from just going over the edge of the cliff again. And I think there's I think justifiably a concern that at a certain point that becomes very self-defeating, basically.
Do you think, and I don't know if we get to this before the big picture stuff, but like he hinted at, Malik Renew is obviously going to come back at some point, so that'll be a change to sort of the starting lineup. But he said he's thinking of that, since these starts have been kind of one of the, I think, common factors in sort of their struggles, they will change the starting lineup. I mean, he's not somebody that does change well. I mean, we've seen I've seen the last 2 years, he's very sort of has his way set in his ways. Do you think something more radical is coming? And I mean, I don't have like a ton of options here, because the guys on the bench aren't playing. I mean, Keenan Carlisle might have been an option, but he's playing. I don't want to be mean to the guy. He's just playing awful.
I mean, he's struggling very badly offensively. I think he's had a lot of good moments defensively, but the reality is, what Indiana thought it was recruiting when it went out and got Carlisle from Stanford was a playmaking, two guard that could also operate off the ball and hit threes, and he has just never found his offense this season at all. His rhythm, where to go for his offense, what are good shots, what are bad shots, how to get the shots he wants, how to find himself in the flow. It's just not happened yet.
But so the question is, do you think he could make changes, or he's going to be willing to make the changes? And like, what do you even think those changes are at this point that, in terms of like the starting lineup, absent Malik Renew, obviously, who at some point will come back. Like, what would you do? What could he do here sort of in the short term to try to find a spark? Because I do think you do. I mean, is it swapping out Mackenzie and Mbako just because I think, there was a lot of fans frustrated when I tweeted out, he went to the bench in Iowa. He wasn't allowed to shoot through it because of his effort, which I get, but he's such a talented playmaker. How do you take him off the floor and come back against a team you're down 20, even though he's less than on defense? But what do you do? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I guess I'll let you take it where you want to go.
No, I mean, I mean, listen, you're right. Like, options are limited in the sense that we've already kind of seen like one of the options would be to pull somebody for Luke Goody. And I think Goody has had a number of good moments, since he's gone into the starting lineup. I know there's obviously the scrum at the end of the game. I don't think he's even, among sort of like Indiana's worst offenders in terms of the way Indiana played against Illinois. He had 13 points. He hit a three. I know he fouled out. Again, I genuinely don't think what happens at the end of the game is, some kind of like everybody, I don't think he was starting something. Basically, I think it was just a, kind of a frustrating night. There's a, kind of a flashpoint moment. One player takes it as one thing when it's something else. And that just kind of leads to what it led to. But the problem with the lineup change specifically is like, you've already kind of done it. Now, if Malik Renew's back and if he's fit enough to play starters minutes, you could start him over Umar Ballo, who I know there were some criticisms of his effort against Illinois. There was at least one clip of him kind of jogging back on defense. I don't think he was the only one. I don't think it's completely unfair, to kind of point at stuff like that. But I do think, it's really easy to cherry pick moments like that too, where you just like,
well, and one thing I think that gets ignored with Ballo is he's playing more minutes than he ever has. Like, he played 34 minutes.
15 rebounds in that game. I don't think you can be overly critical of somebody's effort if they have 15 rebounds in 34 minutes. Like, rebounding is
he just might be tired. He might just be tired.
Yeah, rebounding is a directly like effort-based statistic. And I understand he's bigger than everyone else, but I've seen plenty of 7-footers that were not competent rebounders in Big Ten basketball. You could make that switch if you wanted. And again, some of it, if Renew is healthy enough to play against Ohio State, some of it would have to be, sort of based around whether or not Renew is fit enough to play starters minutes. I suppose you could sit Mackenzie and Mbako down. I would point out Mike Woodson's basically done that these last 3 games. You kind of gloss over it in the USC game because Indiana wins and because other players are playing well. I think Bryson Tucker had 8 or 9 points in that game. But Mbako's only played 15, 16, and 19 minutes. he'd only played fewer than 22 minutes in a game once all season. That was Nebraska. And the 22-minute game was Sam Houston State, when I think you can kind of surmise he just wasn't playing that many minutes because Indiana didn't need him to. My point is, you already kind of have cut back Mbako's minutes, and you're not really getting the response you want. Now, that doesn't mean you just throw a guy back out there if you feel like he's not trying or whatever. But my point is, when he is one of your most important players and you're looking for solutions in real time, maybe you need to look at these last 3 games and say, that's not the way to get it. Whatever we need out of him, that's not the way to get it. And then from there, again, you could put Bryson Tucker in the starting lineup. He's had some good moments. He's had some freshman moments. Yes, Kanan Carlisle has struggled. I don't know what else. I don't think, to your point, I don't think there's a lot you can do with this lineup. I think, and if there is maybe a reason for Indiana fans to, I don't want to say, I'm not telling anybody to retain hope. But, I do think that if Anthony Leal and Luke Goody, and I know some people took exception to some of the things they said, and that's fine. As long as you stop short of abusing people on social media and stuff like that, it is fine for people to have an opinion, whatever it is, on, what players and coaches say publicly. That's fine. But I think that the one hope that kind of Indiana can have, because I don't know how much lineup changes help in the long term when the team kind of is the team at this point, is the idea.
But does it send a message? So you wouldn't do anything.
Who's earned the spot that you're taking away from someone else? Because that's that's the equal message. And again, and I don't want to single out Mackenzie Mbako. I'm using him as an example. He is not like somehow the root of all ills and the only reason Indiana's lost these games. But using Mbako as an example, Mike Woodson has dramatically curtailed his playing time relative to where it was before these last 3 games, in the last 3 games, and not gotten a measurable response, at least thus far. So that doesn't seem to work. And you don't have that many other options anyway. To me, it's more about, can you find a way to ensure that kind of the attitude, the message, the determination that we heard out of Luke Goody and Anthony Leal on Tuesday night is kind of what emotionally sort of permeates this team going forward. Because I think that's the only, that sort of like, we're going to get it together. You don't have to believe in us. We don't care. It's kind of us against the world. Attitude might kind of have to be the thing that carries them. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just feel like if you do nothing, you're sort of just letting the ship sink and just sort of shrugging off. And maybe it's for a game, maybe it's for 2, just to try to send a message that like what happened the last 2 games isn't acceptable. I know people have talked about some of the Bob Knight quotes about being on the bench. Maybe it's like sort of the best inspiration. I don't know. I just think that, because if they go out and lose by 20 again at Ohio State and they don't do any changes or don't do any approach and sort of say like, let's just hope our attitude changes. I don't know. I mean, there's no good solution because, like you said, they're handcuffed by the idea that their roster is their roster and they have sort of limited options. But at some point, you got to do something, right? And maybe the minutes Mackenzie plays, the 15 or 19, it's better at the end of a half instead of the start of the half. I don't know. I just think you got to try to switch up something when the last 2 games have been just so poor. You got to try something.
Should we get into, I guess, for lack of something, a more artful way of saying it, like the wider state of the program? I think, I don't know if there's that much more to go through from these 2 games specifically. I think we can talk about where, the program goes from here. And obviously in the short term, Ohio State, Northwestern, Maryland at home, etc. Obviously also the long term. I've obviously covered a lot of games inside Assembly Hall, and I've never seen an atmosphere quite like what we saw Tuesday night. I mean, like, I've heard booing before. I've never heard the whole student section kind of getting behind, the fire a coach chant the way that it happened. It's the one thing I would say is it's possible that would have happened with Archie. It did basically happen the one game Indiana played in front of fans that year. But because so much of that season was behind closed doors, we'll never have kind of that point of comparison. But it was, I mean, that, you and I have commented more than once this season to each other about how almost like sleepy Assembly Hall has been this season. That, the crowds have been less than capacity. There's been a noticeable sort of lack of, energy in the building. Student attendance has kind of waxed and waned. That I have not heard Assembly Hall get quite that negative before in such a pronounced way for purely performance reasons. And it was jarring. And I think it has to come into any conversation about, where the program is, where it's going, and what needs to happen next.
Well, yeah. I mean, like, I don't, can they steer themselves out of this? And like, what would that even look like? It's like for him to sort of survive that, because it does feel like a point of no return.
Can you remember a time when something like that has happened and a coach, has come back from it? I know there's like the old day stories about, like, for sale signs getting stuck in people's yards and stuff like that. But I mean, certainly in an era when that stuff can be widespread immediately, it can go viral, it can be amplified, it can be disseminated so quickly and can just kind of like, sort of seep into the groundwater of the discourse, so to speak. Like, can you remember a time when a coach got that sort of treatment, up close and in person from their fans and it eventually recovered, basically?
No, I mean, it just rarely happens. I mean, sometimes in football, I guess maybe, like, I'm trying to think of an example. I think there's been a couple where like teams have rattled off just like so many wins but it's different. It's more of a compressed sort of thing. But like, I mean, they got like 2 months left of the season. Like, it's just going to be hard. I think you have to do so well to sort of try to overcome that. Like, you'd have to like win all the rest of your, you're not all of them, but I mean, you have to make like a huge run. And, I think we haven't mentioned it today. We've talked about it. This is a stretch where they play 11 straight quad one games. They have, I think, 4 more against ranked opponents coming up. This is going to be sort of a brutal stretch. They've got a bunch on the road. And so to steer themselves out of it, I just think it's going to be really a challenge. Because like, I think when you talk about sort of the state of things, what happened there?
I think you froze for a second. We got to work on it. We got to send you to Smithville Fiber.
I don't know I lowered the settings. I don't know what's going on here. Is it bad? I'll try the low definition.
You're good. You're good now.
But I think when you talk about the state of the whole, there's no sort of thing you could point to as for hope. Like, what do you look for optimism? And I think that's part of the conversation, because they had to rebuild the roster the last 2 years, and they're going to probably have to do it again after this year.
Yeah, I think he, in a weird way, like, even the sheer tonnage of wins that it would take to sort of pull back from this is just so great, because there is such a loss of faith in the idea that any of this will ever fit into a wider path toward improvement. Does that make sense? And like, I suspect if we do start seen the debates, and not an if, we are seeing the debates begin to, sort of bubble up about whether or not Indiana needs to make a change after this season. And we're beat writers, we're not columnists. I don't think we need to get too deep into like speculation and opinion making and things like that. But, there's going to be some discussion of the idea that like Archie Miller got 4 years, even though he never made a tournament, probably would have made it in 2020. But the point is he never made one. Mike Woodson makes 2 tournaments. Doesn't he deserve more than 4 years? I think whether I agree with it or not, whether you agree with it or not, I think a lot of fans feel like, yes, he made those tournaments and he earned that, and his teams earned those opportunities. But at the end of the day, 4 years is a period of time that is adequate, especially in the modern context of roster building, for determining like whether the long-term course of the program seems to be positive. And just making the tournament in your first 2 years doesn't mean that you aren't still going to get to the end of year 4 and find that was not, necessarily like the status quo, or those were sort of like outliers, and this is what's more concerning because it's more of what maybe people think they would expect if this kind of continued. And I think what is reinforced by these 2 losses specifically, I got my monitor up here, I always feel weird if people wonder why I'm looking away from the camera, is kind of the idea that, like, let's say Indiana goes on the road and beats Ohio State and Northwestern. Let's even say Indiana beats Maryland. But there's like there's just going to be such a pervasive belief now that losses like these are always around the corner, and that losses like these are particularly consistent when you play high level competition, in terms of, when you look at obviously Indiana, Illinois this year, Indiana, Gonzaga this year, Indiana, UConn last year, Indiana, Auburn last year. Indiana, I'm looking at this right now. The last time Indiana beat a team that finished ranked in the KenPom top 10 nationally was Purdue, when they swept Purdue 2 years ago. I believe those are Indiana's only 2 wins against teams under Mike Woodson, against teams that finished in the top 10 in KenPom in a given season. There's just kind of a feeling that eventually when it's time, even if Indiana can pull together 2 or 3 wins, when it's time to test the program against the sorts of teams that Indiana's got to be able to beat if it wants to win Big Ten titles, if it wants to be a genuine national contender, if it wants to reach Final Fours, essentially, there is an established history now that says these will be the likely outcomes. And so there's just kind of like I think a lot of people feel like there's really no reason to believe anymore in the idea of progress that will lead to where this program believes, probably in broad terms anyway, fairly, it should go. And so even if you do beat an Ohio State on the road or a Northwestern on the road, there will always be another Illinois, another Gonzaga, another Arizona, just kind of like waiting around the corner, because when Indiana faces genuinely, high level competition, it winds up overwhelmed like this. And, if you're talking about kind of the direction of the program, the state of the program, what is what is going to have people either feeling like the direction is good and is worth getting behind, or the direction is bad and needs to be changed. The 4 years, I think, is an adequate sample size for people to make those determinations. And I understand anybody who looks at Indiana's record in games like this, and Indiana's not just record, but performances in games like this, and just says far too often Indiana looks, overwhelmed and just non-competitive, and that doesn't seem like it's ever going to change.
Well, and yeah, you saw them blow up the rock. I mean, not on purpose, but I mean, like, you've seen them sort of have a vision with the NIL and sort of trying to build the roster through that. And so like you're just going to keep repeating that, because I mean, like the high school recruiting part of it, I think does sort of factor in that this team has not been raking in the talent here. I mean, they've got McKenzie and Gabe Cups, and then one recruit, Bryson Tucker, this year. They got one recruit next year. Like, what's the long term? There's sort of no long term plan, and so then you're just sort of running it back with the idea of like you're going to be really building through NIL, which, look, I mean, isn't necessarily a. I don't think that's a good strategy for this program, because I think fans would like to invest more in their players and get to know them, but doing that every year is sort of what teams are going to have to. Some teams are going to have to do, but you've seen sort of his vision for it and how he sort of put it all together, and it didn't work. So you're just going to do that again? Like, what's the long term sort of like? I think the recruiting part of it and sort of the roster building part of it, like he sort of whiffed the roster building 2 years in a row, and so you're going to let him do it a third year? Is that like what like how, and you're just going to watch a repeat of it?
Well, that leads me kind of into, and this is going to be a delicate line to walk, because again, I don't think it should be our purview to get into speculation too much. But it does feel a little bit now like for example, I don't think a win Friday night at Ohio State really changes anyone's mind about anything. You know what I mean? Like I don't think that, I think the result, the physical result of a win at Ohio State, or even a win at Ohio State and then a win at Northwestern, it would have to be pretty extreme, very lopsided wins for, I think, people to sort of feel like suddenly all the concerns that bubbled back up from Iowa and from Illinois were just sort of washed out, basically. I mean, I guess it's less of a question and more of an observation. Like, it is very difficult to kind of see where Indiana goes with the status quo at the moment, and that that's a lot of different. There are a lot of different things that can be tied into that, right? That's a tree with a lot of different branches, but it's very hard to. It's just very hard to sort of like, given the atmosphere, given the environment, given the results, given the performances, given everything, to just sort of have a good feel for where this is going, or at least not have a good feel. I think a lot of people feel, have any sort of inclination to believe that there's a positive outcome here for the status quo, basically.
Yeah, because what do you point to as sort of say is a pillar for him to build on? Like, I mean, there's just nothing that right now you could point to as sort of a positive for this program, and it could get worse.
Do you want to talk briefly about you were in Iowa City for both games, and I do think we have not talked a ton about the women's team here, but that felt like a big win, and not just because it's a win on the road, or because of kind of this. I don't call anyone that isn't Purdue or Kentucky Indiana's rival, but this highly competitive.
It's that Iowa thing has developed a rival. Those teams did not like each other. Yeah.
No, you don't. Like, rivalry suggests some measure of tradition. We used to have a rule at the Indiana Daily Student on the sports desk.
Can't you build tradition? Can't you build tradition?
Yeah, but not over a period of 4 years. You can't install innovative new traditions any more than you can unscrew the nails on the coffin of the program. That's a little bit of an inside joke, but and probably sounds like dark humor considering it really is a coffin. Forgive me. I promise it's not. But like, this has become one of the. I think what is fair to say is this has become one of the defining series in the
Which
modern.
would be a synonym for rivalry.
It would not. It would not. In the modern context or the modern construction of Big Ten women's basketball. And I know it's not Caitlin Clark and Mackenzie Holmes anymore. I know that Lisa Bluter's gone. Like things have changed, but especially after Indiana kind of shoots its shot with UCLA at home, got a big crowd for that game. Didn't play necessarily horribly, but obviously it wasn't like that was a one possession game coming down the stretch. Could go either way. This felt like a big one for this team, and not just because of the result, but also, and I will continue to bang this drum as I have for 3 years, because I just felt like you saw the Yarden Garzone that can genuinely be one of the most impactful players in the across the entire conference. And I know that at times she struggles with foul trouble, and sometimes you have players who can shoot and drive and pass and rebound, and what can happen is almost kind of they get in trying to do it all, they get lost in the game a little bit, and a jack of all trades becomes a master of none. But I mean, that was a Yarden Garzone that demonstrably lifts this team's ceiling, which was already competitive in the Big Ten, should be in the NCAA tournament, still a very well-constructed team. But that's Indiana at a different level if Yarden Garzone finds that kind of performance more consistently.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I think also sort of a key part of this turnaround has been the transfers have sort of settled in. Shea Chesky and Carolyn Strickland sort of struggled through the first month and a half. And they were sort of, Terry's got a very sort of intense way about her and sort of and got a very specific system and way she does things. And so I think it took some time to adjust, and you saw that sort of work itself out on the floor. They look much more comfortable and are in Shea, even when she's not hitting threes, has sort of done a lot now offensively. Carolyn Strickland's been sort of more consistent coming off the bench and giving them a presence. So I think it's all kind of come together for this team. I think it was their third win against a top 25 opponent. The UCLA game wasn't one possession, but it was more competitive than anybody. I haven't looked at sort of the last week and a half, but I mean, UCLA 17-0. It's the best start in their program history. They've been a juggernaut.
Played UCLA about as well as almost anybody else has.
That's my point.
Yes. Yeah.
And they've got a monster in the post that's just really impressive. And now this will probably get posted. They've got Illinois tonight on a Thursday night, and then obviously USC, another top 5 team on Sunday. That'll be another measuring stick game. I don't know if their ceiling's that high in terms of competing with UCLA, competing with USC. But like you said, I could see this team making a run to the Sweet 16 the way that they played at Iowa. I think you saw that.
I think you almost I don't want to say Indiana fans get spoiled, but I think you forget just how consistent things were for that program. Grace Berger was around for a long time. Mackenzie Holmes was around for a long time. This kind of turnover is a little more common in terms of, having to replace, 2 or 3 key pieces between starters and reserves at a time. You talk about the transfer settling in. I think that has been sort of, demonstrable. And I also think again, this is the journey that most teams go on, right? Most teams aren't fully formed in November. And Indiana has, it's kind of like 2 good games and a bad game out in Atlantis. And you sort of feel like, okay, well, what's this team all about? And what it really is about is, in November, when Indiana is not just adapting in some key new players, but also having to reconfigure some roles. You're asking bigs to step into minutes they didn't have to play when Mackenzie Holmes was around. You're asking, players to take on more of an offensive load or different defensive responsibilities. You're going to do some of this. And I'm not trying to pull this back to the women are, they are obviously in better shape of the program than the men, but I'm not trying to sort of make all of this about IU men's basketball. But to use it as kind of a point of comparison, pretty directly, literally across the lobby in Cook Hall. The difference is that what you feel like you see from Terry Morin's team this year is there's inconsistency, but there's progression, and there's a steady build upward. And hey, listen, you talk about Illinois tonight, like all it takes is one bad week, as we've seen, and suddenly it feels like that goes, kind of off the rails. But I was even impressed a little bit with that Northwestern win in the sense that, I think Terry Morin herself said it wasn't pretty, but it was a win. It was a win on the road in the Big Ten. And how many times do we wind up talking about a team, a men's team, a women's team, whatever, where basically they have the moment like Iowa, but they can't handle the moment like Northwestern, where it's like, hey, we're not playing well. We're on the road. We should win. It's not pretty, but we do. And then that gives you the platform to go to Iowa, and no one will ever remember that Northwestern game ever again. But it means that when you go to Iowa and you win, you don't feel like you are winning to compensate for some earlier mistake. That's, again, you're going up a level. And just like steadily, it feels like even through, at times, some dips, some inconsistencies this season, which were to be expected, there have been demonstrable steps upward consistently for this team. And now we're in mid-January again. And I don't know if we're talking about, a Big Ten contender as such. You talk about how good UCLA has been this season, obviously USC as well. But we are certainly talking about, I think, a program that even through the departure in the last couple of years of some really talented, for this program's history, generational players, a program that is clearly, sort of staying put in that upper tier in the Big Ten, in that tier that expects annually to be winning a certain number of games, to be making the tournament with ease, to be, as you talk about, a contender to get to the second weekend, the kind of team that can beat just about anybody, certainly at home, but this is obviously a really good road game or road win. It just feels like, kind of, again, I'm not trying to make this all about the men or even the men versus the women, but to use the men as a point of comparison, this is what it looks like when a team does need some time and does need some seasoning, but gets it, handles it well, grows in the right way, matures in the right way, and this is the result on the other side.
Yeah, and I think too, winning close games. They actually fell behind in that Northwestern game in the final 2 minutes and had to pull it out. Obviously, Iowa got, they got a little rattled with some of the pressure that I was bringing, kind of, and trying to with a flurry in the last couple of minutes, but pulled it out. I think those games could be good for sort of your confidence, and sort of as building blocks for the future in terms of like this team has won now some tough battles, and not just against lesser competition, won easy at home, which they tend to do. But so like I think this was a good week, or last week was a good week. I guess Sunday was this week, but like the last week has been good for the program in terms of setting even more, going forward, like we can call back on those moments. And like you said, if Yarden plays like that, I mean, like she did against Iowa, things are going really well for this program. And I think Sydney Parrish, I don't know what percentage she's at. I don't think she's at 100%, but as she gets healthier too going forward, I think this team has got a lot to feel good about.
You almost kind of like got the best of both worlds with like in the sense that you did have to close out a tight game at Iowa, but on the other hand, like, and I know you and I talked about it, just kind of like in text or something, but like there's an alternate reality where it was very bizarre that they wiped that Garzone 3 off in the fourth quarter when the girl was
with the
woman was pushing through the screen. I understand, like, I guess to some extent the letter of the law. To me, a shot off of a screening action and a foul on the screener are all part of the same basketball play, and one should not cancel out the other. But like, there's a world where that shot goes down and Iowa just kind of rolls over, and Indiana wins that game and maybe by all rights should win that game by double digits, by 14, 15, 16 points. But then they also have to kind of endure. That felt like it gave Iowa life. Iowa pushes back, and they have to kind of figure out how to close out that game, and they do. And it's almost, to me, a little bit like you kind of get the best of both outcomes. The feeling that you maybe should have won that game, maybe deserved to win that game by double digits, just because of the nature away of the way that fourth quarter plays out, and the officiating decision, whatever. You have to play through a crowd and some tight moments and whatever, and they did that as well. And that was just a really valuable win, and a win that, again, it it felt like validated a lot of what we've seen through the first 2.5 months of the season from Terry Morin's team, that there has just been kind of this it's never fully linear, but this steady kind of, the curve has just kind of stayed pointed upward. So any other business? We haven't done one of these and did we do one last week? I don't remember. With all the snow days and sick days, everything's bleeding together. Are we going to do another one tomorrow night in Columbus?
Sure.
Well, the fun thing about Columbus is there's, and they always turn the beer taps off, obviously, but it feels swanky because there's like a little fan club right next to the media room. And we always go in there to shoot the video. And so you're always a little bit like, feels like you got that donor access. Now, the question is, like, how many people are going to be at this game? Because I think half of Columbus is in Atlanta this weekend for the Ohio State Notre Dame.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But I think we could see record levels of non-attendance at this game, because you also typically get a fair number of IU fans at these games, because there's obviously a lot of IU fans in Eastern Indiana and Western Ohio, that this is a better opportunity. It's easier to get tickets, whatever, for them to see Indiana. Not sure you're going to get as much turnout right now as maybe you would in a normal year. I wouldn't be stunned if it's a sleepy Friday night at the Schottenstein Center, but we will find out. We will be there. But between now and then, it's not very far. It's less than 36 hours away. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman for the Bloomington Herald-Times, for the Indianapolis Star. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been Mind Your Banners for January 16th. We will be back. Yeah, I think we will be back tomorrow night after IU Ohio State in Columbus to talk about that game. Between now and then, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.